Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 12. Carrahs-Din. The city of Carrahs-Din was ancient. Nestled amongst steep-sided bluffs, its citadel towered over the valley that lay before it, giving a view to miles of the surrounding forest. Peary awoke in his quarters to find a messenger patiently awaiting him. "What is it, Bent?" he asked the boy. "The council requires your presence, Master Peary." The boy was clearly in a state of excitement. Before Peary could question him further, Bent told him everything in a rush. An army of Faereyas had been routed along the border. It was being said that the Unscarred had returned to help the Ka in their darkest hour. "Thank you, Bent," said Peary as he rushed past the boy. If the council was demanding his presence, it showed they were truly afraid. Peary's relationship with the Council of Elders was tenuous at best, and they were usually more than happy to conduct business without him. Hastening his pace, he made his way through the maze-like network of halls and interconnected hallways within the citadel. Peary walked into the circular room to find the assembled elders seated in silence. Before them stood the Zka Motavi Galen, alongside two Faereyas. One of the elders, an old man named Quintus, scowled as Peary took his seat. "Esteemed elders of the Ka, the Unscarred has returned to us," intoned Galen. "My name is Eric," said one of the Faereyas as he stepped forward. "I come from beyond the mountains to the east, the verdant valleys." "From beyond the mountains, the Faerey says," replied Quintus incredulously. "This is pure nonsense, Galen." "Nonsense or not, here I stand," Eric retorted. "So you came to fight for us?" asked Quintus, leaning forward in his seat. "And you have brought a Faerey with you, as a gift? A sacrifice?" Hoke glanced sideways at Eric as Galen stepped forward. "These Faereyas have been blooded. Hoke of House Kalan of Taransay undertook our warrior's right, and bested a black mantis. He is of the Zka, and will be treated as such. Further, Eric the Unscarred and Hoke fought alongside the Zka in battle, where we all witnessed the power of the Unscarred." "Bah! Nonsense," said Quintus. "The Unscarred has been gone from this world for thousands of years." Eric removed his shirt and glanced over his shoulder. "Galen?" The Ka Motavi slowly drew his blade. Galen looked the young chosen in his eyes. "Are you ready?" Eric closed his eyes and exhaled. "Do it," he replied quietly. In a quick flurry of motion, Galen slashed Eric twice across his bare chest, leaving long bloody furrows across his flesh. Blood welled from the gashes and spilled onto the floor. Gasps of horror could be heard from among the assembled elders at the sudden outbreak of violence. Galen drew back his sword arm and thrusted forward with his blade, taking Eric through his heart. "My deepest apologies, Alik," whispered Galen, still clutching his sword hilt tightly. Eric grimaced. "Get it out," he croaked. Galen nodded and swiftly withdrew his sword from the young chosen's chest. Eric slumped to his knees as he took a deep breath. "Water," said Eric, looking to a young messenger along the far wall. Peary nodded to the boy, and he brought a small carafe to Eric. Eric motioned to his bloodied chest. Pour. The boy poured the water over Eric's skin, washing away the blood. He gasped when he saw unbroken skin. A hushed chorus of whispers ran through the crowd. Unscarred, the people called. Quintus scoffed. A parlor trick to fool children. But the mood in the room made it clear that Quintus's opinion was in the minority. "We will gather tomorrow at noon," Quintus announced to the room. "The council will need to deliberate this." The council stood and began to exit the room. Peary waited quietly as Quintus paused beside Hoke. "I will personally take your head after this pretender is dead, Farron." Hoke laughed at the audacity of the statement. The Ka elder chuckled darkly as he turned his hawkish gaze upon Peary. "I leave them in your care, poison eater," barked Quintus. Peary gave a slight bow in response as the Ka elder shuffled away. Galen smiled broadly. "Eric and Hoke, I have known Peary since he was a child, and I trust him with your lives. If you will please excuse me, I have business that I must attend to." Peary bowed his head in respect. "You honor me, Matavi. I will see that no harm comes their way." "Please follow me," said Peary. Peary led them through a side door and out into a small courtyard before entering a darkened doorway. Further and further into the stone edifice they traveled before coming to a stop at a stout wooden door. Peary placed his hand upon the door and closed his eyes and whispered an incantation. The sounds of turning latches issued from behind the door before it opened with a slight click. "Couldn't they put you a little further away?" asked Hoke as they entered the room. "I think they like you about as much as they like me." Peary laughed darkly. "True, but nobody's threatened to take my head today." Hoke gave a small chuckle in return. Peary looked sideways at Eric. Quintus is not accustomed to his words falling upon deaf ears. He will certainly have something planned when the council reconvenes tomorrow. Eric shrugged. "I can only do what I feel is right, and that feeling has led me here." "You are like Ander," said Peary. "I see what she meant now," he muttered to himself. Eric was caught off guard by the sudden proclamation. "You know Ander? How?" he asked the Ka. Peary shook his head. "Where to start?" he muttered to himself. Before. The tree stood tall, overlooking the sheltered valley below like a benign king of days forgotten. It was an oak, common to the region and completely unspectacular. Like other trees, it sprouted leaves in the spring only to shed them in the fall. But this tree was in the twilight of its lifespan. Like a man, it had begun to bald in its golden years, giving the appearance of a multi-fingered hand reaching forth to the heavens from its many-leafed boughs below. A large crow unceremoniously landed upon one of the many bare branches, careless to the woes of the slowly dying tree. Cawing loudly, it cocked its head to its side as it eyed the village below. A man-thing. The village served only as a source of noise and oft-times food as the people below kept many gardens. Cawing again, the crow listened to the winds. From the distant end of the valley, another crow answered its call. Setting into flight, the crow's downward force broke the thin branch from the dying tree. Clattering to the ground below, the branch's fall was broken by a pile of prematurely fallen leaves. As the wind gusted, the remaining leaves fluttered on their branches, giving the impression that the large tree was sighing, perhaps in sadness or in resignation to the passage of time. In the village below, a small boy lay upon his parents' bed, shivering uncontrollably despite the many furs piled atop him. Like the tree, he was dying, but not due to the passage of time. He had simply fallen ill to a degenerative disease. It was likely due to an evil spirit, the village shaman had explained to his parents. The boy was too young to understand the repercussions of such a word, but he could sense from his parents that he was near death. He had also overheard something they had intended to keep from him. The shaman had told his parents of a possible remedy. "You must build a domed hut of fallen branches, chest height, covered in freshly pulled wild grasses, but leaving a hole the width of a hand centered in the roof," the shaman had explained. He must build a small fire inside the hut, occasionally feeding green branches into the flames. The shaman then gave his father a vial of liquid. The boy must also take a single drop, he said. "What is this?" his father asked, eyeing the viscous liquid. "Poison from the mandible of a freshly fallen mantis," the shaman answered flatly. "Mantis poison," his mother exclaimed. "He will be killed. Is there truly no hope to be had?" "He will not die," said the shaman. "If you follow my instructions, he will be fine. The purpose of using the poison is to drive the spirit out of the boy. Once out of his body, it will become one with the smoke, rising through the hole in the roof and dispersing amongst the winds." Nightly he had listened to his parents argue over what to be done, but tonight would be the end of it. His mother was set against the idea, but his father believed in the shaman, and Peary believed in his father. "Even if he were to survive, he would be different," cried his mother. "He would only be stronger," argued his father, "and the others would see it as a blessing from the Creator. He would be looked up to, sought out for advice after his manhood rites." "But you don't know." "I know, mother," said Peary, interrupting her. "Peary," exclaimed his mother, "what are you doing out of bed?" She embraced her son and felt his forehead. "His fever has gone down. Perhaps the Creator has spared him." "He has," answered Peary. "I prayed, and he came to me. He said I was to do as the shaman instructed if I was to remain well." "How did you know of what the shaman said?" demanded his mother, suspiciously eyeing her husband. "The Creator told me," lied Peary. If his plan was to work, he would need to convince his mother. His father needed no such prodding. His father fell to his knees and clasped his hands together, silently thanking the heavens for sparing his only son. Early the next morning, his father took him from the village far into the woods. While building the hut, his father explained to him what the shaman had said. "Will it hurt?" asked Peary. "I do not know," his father answered. "How long will it take?" "I do not know." "I'm scared," he at last admitted. His father worked the last of the grass into the roof and turned to face his son. "You are only 12 turnings of the seasons in this life. Your test of manhood is still years away." Taking him by his shoulders, his father looked deep into his eyes. "Do you remember what I've taught you of enlightenment?" Peary nodded. His father had told him many times of man's struggle to obtain enlightenment. "How will you do it?" asked his father. "I don't know. What should I do?" "Find the place of perfection between the flame and the air which feeds it," answered his father. "You must exist there, my son." His father then set a pile of tinder aflame and quickly ushered Peary inside. Before enclosing him inside, his father gave him the vial of liquid from the shaman. "Listen carefully, Peary. You must take only a drop of this. Any more than a drop and you will die. Do you understand?" "Yes, father." "It is important to keep your fire burning. You must keep an unblemished line of smoke rising through the roof." "I will. How long will it take?" "Only you will know." "I am sorry for this, my son," said his father as he enclosed him within the hut. "You are experiencing something beyond this world." Peary sat watching the fire. The silence within the small hut was occasionally broken by snaps and pops coming from the small fire. He thought about his father's last words, wondering what they meant. He looked at the vial of liquid and pulled the stopper. Attached to the cork plug was a thin rod of glass trailing into the vial. Holding the cork above the fire, Peary noticed a small droplet forming upon the end of the glass rod. He raised it to his mouth and allowed the drop to fall to his tongue. Peary instinctively swallowed and felt his throat constrict. He quickly replaced the stopper and dropped the vial as his muscles began to contract. Feeling as though his body was on fire, he remembered the words of his father. He fought to pull himself into a sitting position. Once upright, he concentrated on the flames before him. Writhing and dancing with each exhalation, the flames quickly lulled him into a dreamlike state. Peary fell to his side and rolled onto his back. As he stared through the hole in the roof, gasping for breath, darkness engulfed him. Cold air suddenly filled the small hut. Snapping his eyes open, Peary bolted upright, pulling in a ragged, deep breath. His head throbbed in tune with the beating of his heart as he fought off rising waves of nausea. He felt the bitter bite of cold and looked to his fire, but in its place was a perfect circle of freshly fallen snow. Looking at the sky through the roof, he saw only a white haze. Peary parted the framework of the hut and crawled outside. The landscape surrounding him was covered in glistening whiteness. The leaf-bare branches of the trees overhead swayed gently in the breeze. Hearing the gurgle of water, he crossed the clearing and pushed through a line of small pines. Just beyond the trees, he found a small stream. Peary stooped to drink and caught sight of his reflection. Gone were the dark circles beneath his eyes and the ever-showing signs of fatigue. Plunging his hands into the frigid water, he drank deeply and felt the rawness in his throat begin to subside. Hearing a branch snap behind him, he turned expectantly. "Father!" shouted Peary. A soft hooting was the only answer he received. Pushing back through the pines, he found a small white owl perched upon the roof of his hut. The owl flapped its wings and took flight. Rising majestically into the air, the bird tucked its wings to its side and dove into the hut. Peary stared in astonishment. Never in his life had he heard of an animal behaving in such a fashion. He nearly fell over in surprise as a voice issued from the hut. "Come in, young Peary." His fear nearly overwhelmed him into running, but the voice again beckoned him. "Please, I promise, I won't hurt you. Come inside, Peary." Swallowing his fear, Peary crawled through the small doorway. Seated inside was an old man, quietly humming to himself as he stirred the fire. He looked up and gave Peary a warm smile. "Who are you?" asked Peary, feeling suspicious of the man. "My name is Ander," said the old man. "What happened to your bird?" asked Peary. Ander remained quiet but fixed Peary with a knowing smile. "You ask a lot of questions, young Peary, but that is nothing to scold over." "How do you know my name?" "From the lips of youth," said Ander with a smile. Peary fixed Ander with an uncertain stare but remained silent. Ander continued. "Now, do you know where you are?" asked the old man. "Not how you came to be here, that I'm sure you know." "My father brought me here," Peary answered. "Yes, he did, in a manner of speaking, but not here," said Ander, motioning to the walls around them. "I don't understand," said Peary, feeling confused. "Your father did a foolish thing, Peary. You were sick, and he was desperate. It's understandable. Your mother was right, and whether you will eventually forgive your father is up to you," explained Ander. "Your village shaman instructed him to give you poison to drive out an evil spirit. However, you have now been thrust into a perilous situation. You will forever need this," said Ander, holding up the small vial. "Why?" asked Peary, sounding afraid. "Like any drug, it gives with one hand while it takes with the other. It preserved your life, but you will never be able to stray from its reach. You and the toxin are now one." Peary remained silent, suddenly very afraid. "You needn't fear, Peary," said Ander. "You survived, and it's a miracle that you did. The Creator has offered you a life far more rewarding than what you would have had. When I saw you in this clearing, I thought you were but a wandering spirit. Then I saw you drink from the stream, something a spirit cannot do, so I came to help you." "Help me how?" asked Peary. "To start with, I'll tell you where you are," said Ander. He stopped briefly to eye the young man. Giving him a nod, Ander continued. "What you are not seeing is the Lightless Lands," he said with a broad sweep of his hand. Peary seemed confused. "Not seeing?" he asked, feeling stupid, for he clearly saw the old man before him. "May I pose you a question, young Peary?" asked Ander in response. "Like a riddle?" asked Peary quickly. "If you'd like." At the prospect of hearing a riddle, Peary puffed out his chest and held his head high, for among his people riddling was the province of men alone, not a child such as he. "I would like, but is it permitted? I've not yet reached my test of manhood." "You are not among your people here, Peary. Though the Lightless Lands belong to all, you are the first of your people to visit in over 3 centuries. I believe our riddle will not be overheard, so we're quite safe," finished Ander. Nodding slightly, Peary firmly spoke the ritual words. "Ask and be damned." Ander smiled and spoke. "Ever rising, ever falling, bringing round the cocks a-calling, sometimes hazy, sometimes bright, oft-times reflecting in the night. It touches dew with fingers long, retires in splendor, pure and strong." Peary cupped his chin in his hand as he pondered the question. Ander smiled in his grandfatherly way and continued to poke about the fire. Stealing a quick glance at the old man, he was reassured to find Ander paying him no mind. "If you don't mind, I'd like to think it over outside." "Of course," answered Ander, waving the young man away. Crawling outside, Peary looked at the sky as he stood. It shone gray, but not as an overcast day, rather as a sunny day without blue nor sun. Suddenly feeling sure of himself, he crawled back inside. "The sun," he answered simply. "As they say in the southern continent, you are correct, Peary," replied Ander. "And how did you find your answer?" There is no sun in this sky. So, why should that matter? Peary was suddenly dumbstruck. He had no clue why that should matter. Beginning to feel irritated by the question, he answered in anger. You're the one who asked the riddle, and I solved it, so you tell me why it should matter. Ander sat back from the fire, placing his stick aside. If I've offended you, Peary, I apologize. But in the lands of light, not the kingdom, mind you, but suffice to say the real world, I am a teacher, and it is my job to pose questions to youngsters. Feeling ashamed of himself, Peary began to stammer an apology. No, you were quite in keeping, becoming agitated with me. I know something about your people, and your education is lacking beyond what it takes to raise crops in a family. But perhaps I may assist in filling that void. How so? Asked Peary, wishing to learn. I will teach you many things, Peary. Things beyond what many of your people know or even remember. I will teach you here. Here? Asked Peary. Yes. This is a place you will visit often, and when you do, I will hear your call. Remember the owl? He asked. Just focus on its call, and wherever I am, I will hear. Now, you must return as our time has run short. Reaching into the fire, Ander cupped a dancing flame in his palm. Holding it up to his face, he gently blew on it, causing it to leap into a roaring blaze. Hold out your hand, said Ander. Peary hesitantly extended his hand, and Ander carefully allowed the flame to slip off onto Peary's outstretched palm. Looking down, Peary was amazed to see he was holding fire in his bare hand. Just remember what your father told you, said Ander. Find that place of perfection and exist within it. Enthralled by the dancing flame, Peary felt his body pulled downward into darkness. Alone, he floated in a vast emptiness. Looking around, he saw a pinpoint of gray within the void. He turned toward it, but a muffled voice issued from behind him. Do not go there. It is there from which you have left. Where do I go? He called out into the darkness. Away from the gray, the voice answered. Turning his back on the gray, he found himself lying on the ground inside the smoke-filled hut. He coughed loudly. His throat burned and his eyes stung. Crawling outside, he stood up. He felt his vision swim from the rush of blood to his head, and he fell to his knees and vomited. Catching sight of a line of small pines, he crawled through them and found a small stream. Drinking greedily, he caught sight of his reflection. Though streaked with soot, his face looked healthy. It's gone, he whispered to himself. The spirit has left me. He carefully rose to his feet and walked back to the hut. Crawling back inside, he found the fire smoldering and fed some small branches into its waiting maw. Remembering the vision, he felt the ground around him. Lying beneath the buckskin, he found it, the small vial. Pulling a thread from his shirt, he wound it around the vial, creating a loop. As Peary placed it around his neck, he couldn't help but feel as though it were a leash. Now. Peary smiled. I'm what my people call a poison eater. My ability allows me to travel to another realm, a place called the Lightless Lands. It was in that strange realm where I first met Ander. He was my first mentor in the mystic arts. He only asked that I work towards the betterment of my people. That sounds like Ander. I seek his counsel. How does one enter this realm? Asked Eric. Peary frowned. I haven't seen Ander in many years. I could try calling to him, but it has been some time. Eric nodded. Please do. Peary crossed into a chamber with a small brazier in the center of the room. He set about building a fire while explaining his ability. After I ingest a minuscule amount of mantis venom and go into a meditative state, I will leave my body behind and enter the Lightless Lands. Please do not touch or disturb me. Peary sat on a small cushion before the fire and produced a glass vial from the sleeves of his robe. Uncorking the vial, he allowed a small drop to fall into his mouth. His body stiffened and his eyes glazed over as he stared into the flames. What in the fuck kind of magic is this, Hawk? Muttered Hoke, whispering to himself. Eric ignored the Farron and focused on Peary. Within seconds of taking the poison, his body appeared to flicker in and out of Eric's other perception. On the island, he had spent years learning the different paths of magic. The monks used a form of prayer, long incantations that needed to be memorized, and once preparations were made, a spell could be cast. Eric quickly learned that he could wield magic with a caress of his mind, almost as though he were willing the spell into being. Ander took over his lessons soon afterwards. Eric shook his head. Only now, through the prism of hindsight, did he begin to understand the lengths that Ander had gone to keep Eric's true nature hidden from the others on the island. He wanted to know why. Eric allowed his perception to shift, and he saw Piri's astral form begin to rise from his body. Piri looked shocked when he caught Eric's eye. "Can you truly see me?" he asked in astonishment. Eric nodded and turned to Hoke. "I am going too. We will return as quickly as possible." Before Hoke could reply, Eric's body stiffened, his eyes fixed upon the space just above Piri's seated form. Suddenly cut free from gravity, Eric felt a moment of buoyancy as his astral form left his body. He looked at Piri. "Lead the way." Hoke looked from Piri to Eric, both frozen in place. "Right. I'll be here," he said. "Just me and you two fucking human statues," he added, whispering to himself. Eric followed as Piri shot into the sky above them. Turning toward the east, Piri furrowed his brow in concentration. "I've reached out, but as I said, it has been some time since Ander has heeded my call," said the Ka mage. But Eric's mind was elsewhere. The world spread out below them looked so familiar, yet subtly different. He searched the sky around them. What clouds could be seen were wispy and hung lightly in the air. But even they looked off. In a flash of insight, he realized the cause. "No sun," he proclaimed quietly. "This place is weird." Piri nodded in agreement. "I've been visiting the Lightless Lands for years, and it always nags at me, clawing at the back of my mind. Living here would drive a man insane." "Does anything live here?" asked Eric. Piri nodded. "Yes, but living? That I cannot say." Eric turned to Piri. "What do you mean?" "I've seen shades in this place, lost spirits. Most are as fireflies. They float about, intent upon their own ends, and pay visitors no mind. Some retain vestiges of their former selves and can be interacted with, though I found one that is to be avoided. I encountered it once in my youth, but quickly fled. It was as though a shadow were made into emotion. I could feel its seething malevolence, its need to dominate and destroy. I was left with a slight chill, and for days after, whenever I returned, I felt a lingering sense of being watched, from behind the trees, from beneath the rocks, and sequestered amongst the grasses, all the places a shadow should be but couldn't exist in a land without light. Eric was suddenly filled with a feeling of danger. "Piri, something is happening. We must return, now." In a flash, they returned to their bodies. Piri jumped to his feet. "We are not alone," he said as he assumed a fighting stance. Eric looked around. "Where is Hoke?" Hawk closed the book before her and sat back in her seat. Night had fallen like a heavy woolen blanket around the tower of Terransay. Looking at the heavy roof beams far overhead, she sighed and rubbed her temples. Hawk was feeling irritable. She had expected a reaction from her brother at the news of their father's treason, but Hoke had practically shrugged it off. "What do you expect? He's a wretched cunt. Let me know when charges have been leveled," Hoke had blithely replied. Hawk gritted her teeth as she donned her leather training armor and began her sword drills. She had energy to burn and intended to take out her frustrations with a sword in hand. As she went through her practiced motions, her boots echoed across the wooden floor. She moved with precision and efficiency, creating a deadly dance as she shifted from one form to the next. Her training was interrupted by Hoke. He was whinging again. "Patience, brother. Why don't you use this time to see what he has on his bookshelf?" said Hawk with a laugh. "I am being serious," she argued. In the citadel of Carrahs-Din, Hoke scanned the spines of several books on a nearby shelf. "Are you fucking serious with this? You expect me to just sit quietly and read a book?" asked Hoke. He laughed. "Of course you are." A small sound issued from behind him. He turned to find a hooded man quietly standing in the middle of the room. Before Hoke could say anything, the man stepped forward and plunged a dagger into his stomach. Hoke gasped for breath and stumbled backwards, clutching the knife's hilt as it protruded from his midsection. Hundreds of miles away in the tower of Terransay, Hawk's eyes widened in horror. She hastily scribbled a note to Althenia and tucked it inside a book on her desk. Scanning the room around her, she quickly backed up against the wall and pushed off with as much strength as she could muster, sprinting toward the center of the room. With a small inrush of air, she disappeared as she jumped. Hawk suddenly appeared in Piri's room within the citadel of Carrahs-Din. Carrying the momentum she had built in Terransay, she dropped her shoulder and rammed into the hooded assailant as hard as she could. The man was sent flying into a nearby wall. He crashed with a thud and crumpled to the floor. Piri and Eric rushed into the room but stopped in confusion as they took in the scene before them. "Hey guys," she said as she sheathed her sword. "I'm Hawk." Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of the Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.